Hello and welcome to the World Discord podcast. How you doing today, Joel?
I'm okay. I'm looking forward to this discussion today. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, I've been having this discussion every day for the last month. So yes, it'd be nice to have it with an expert.
Someone
And
who knows what they're talking about.
exactly, that's
Yeah.
always a good thing. So
No pressure, Alex.
He's Joel Ostrow. I'm Brian Endless. Thanks for joining us again today. You might have noticed that since the President Trump has taken office, we've kind of been in a world that's dominated by the things that he and his people do. We talked about that domestically last week. This week, we're going to talk about some of the international aspects. Good news, bad news. There are hundreds of things that are being influenced here. One of the things before getting into the show itself is I just want to remind everybody we look at the United States, most of us listening to it live here, and we might think of ourselves as an important country or not. You might like the fact that we're an important country or not. But the fact is, the rest of the world looks at us as an incredibly important country. We are incredibly important to foreign affairs. We have insanely important alliances. Our partners count on us. Our trading partners count on us. Countries that, well, no country has very little to do with us. We have our fingers in every place. And when we see a major change like this happens, it reverberates. We can't just think of what this is going to do to us. This is important to people and countries around the world and our relationships. And on that basis, we've asked our guest to come in today to provide some expertise, both on our relationships with NATO and our European allies, and also possibly the rest of the world. We'll see where it goes. Joel, you want to introduce our guest?
I do. Brian, I would just add to what you said. Those effects on other states around the world do come back to affect us, whether we want to believe that or not.
Oh, yeah.
So, in the end, this does affect our country and us individually and collectively. So, with that, we are fortunate to be joined by Professor Alexandra Chinchilla, Texas Agriculture and Mining University, which normal people call Texas A&M. And Alex, if you don't mind, I guess I should ask. I was moved by the closing speaker at the Munich Security Conference, the outgoing president, Christoph Heuskens. Did you manage to see that? His talk, it was moving.
I didn't. Honestly, there was so much news
There was a
coming out
lot
of that
going.
conference.
Well, so let me summarize it. He had been a major foreign policy advisor, serving various government positions under former Chancellor Angela Merkel. He's had positions at the UN, and for the last several years has been the president of the Munich Security Conference. He's the outgoing president as of the close of the conference last week, and he gave some comments about the week's proceedings, but then commented on Vice President Vance's um, address that had happened earlier the day that was quite unnerving. And then he started to reference the appearance of the United States uh, abandoning our traditional norms since the end of the Second World War and moving in another direction. But he couldn't finish his thought because he broke down in tears. And the camera panned and showed that many of the other diplomats, government officers from all of the European states, and academics, many of them also in tears. And that was how the conference ended. Um, I don't know, not having seen it, if you can comment on that, but I wonder what you would make of how do just Europeans view what's happening here, just among themselves. If you could comment on that to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and really glad to be here to sort of process the
Mm,
feelings for the past week. And so I really love Brian and Joel both where you sort of started the conversation. And I think that you sort of focused us in right away on the immaterial or social aspects of what's going on here. That this is
right.
not just a
Yep.
story about what it takes to defend a continent, but really a story about relationships that have been built over decades and real human feelings involved, I think, in what's going on
Mm,
here. And this is what is so
absolutely.
surprising. So to me, from if we when we have these discussions, and I had the privilege of spending a week in Berlin over the summer as part of this fellowship program with the German Marshall Foundation. One of the things that we talked about um, in collaboration with folks across German economy and government was the Germans were sort of trying to get a sense of where the U.S. elections were going, what was going to happen. And one thing that I highlighted for them was that Trump is not Trump is tapping into bigger structural issues that are going to make it hard for the U.S. to stay committed to Europe, and I think that that's very there. But what we're really experiencing over this past, especially this past week, is a sense that it's not just this sort of like cold, calculated realignment of interests, but I think a lot of Europeans feel a little blindsided by how personal it feels and how some of these aspects of norms or the strong ties that the United States has built from a diplomatic perspective of really creating this secure what we call like a security community, a group of states that have shared perceptions about what security is and how to relate to one another. And that's the part that I think is really shifting. So people are having very emotional reactions to it.
Absolutely, and it goes in so many different directions too. Let's stick on the social side for a minute because I think you very appropriately used that word. I just saw Steve Bannon threw another Nazi
Yep.
salute yesterday at CPAC, and he was finishing a speech and threw it out there. And
It was unmistakable too.
no, oh yeah, no, absolutely. And the
Yeah.
audience is applauding for it. And I've been talking to a lot of students and even friends who don't understand Europe. In the US, this is hate speech. This is a terrible thing, but we also consider it to be free speech. And one of those things, that's not the way most Europeans, and especially
Yeah.
Germany and Austria and France and others view it. Can you give us a little bit of a feeling about that, just so people understand? Again, how our leaders and people who are speaking in the United States, how we're viewed by ordinary people and by leaders.
Well, I think this is what I mean. This is what you can notice is that there was a sense I think among Europeans to try to rationalize it or to think like, okay, we survived the first Trump administration, we're going to make it through the second one. And I think what's really quickly becoming apparent is that it's not going to just be a repeat of the first Trump
Right.
administration. It's going to have all these different elements. That's partly because the people, the coalition of who's in the Trump team, who's out of the Trump team, who elected Trump, who didn't, I think is a different coalition perhaps than what happened the first time around. So there's some new actors. Um, so for the European side, I think this is very disorienting because there have been a lot of changes to U.S. foreign policy over the past, since the end of the Second World War. There have been Republican and Democrat administrations. We can think back to the George W. Bush administration and
Oh
how
yeah.
the invasion of Iraq really riled the Europeans and created this deep sense of a negative reaction to the U.S. what they felt was the U.S. overstepping. But this feels different, I think, because a lot of the things that we sort of assumed that we share in common, I think, are being questioned. Kind of to your point about,
Yeah.
what domestic political themes the Trump camp
Yeah.
is drawing from.
I mean,
Oh,
they're pretty much
absolutely.
outright saying Europe doesn't matter to us, which is really frightening. And I don't know if you heard um, the leader. I can't remember his name of a self-described far right party in France was supposed to attend the same CPAC conference. He turned around and went home. He refused to attend after that, which is really kind of interesting to say the least. But I think gets to what you're saying. Like I think maybe from over here. Um, at least for myself, I've looked at the far right European parties and thought of them um, perhaps as further to the right and rejecting of some common norms than may be the case, because we've seen now in Italy, um, uh, there was all this panic when, what's her name? Is it Negrani won? There's been worry about Le Pen's party in France. I think the Germans are more worried about AFD than perhaps those and those. But we've seen sort of still a commitment to Europe and what Europe means for at least many of those on the right in Europe, that perhaps suggests more division there um, than I'd thought. I thought it'd been more extreme. Maybe like there's obviously a lot of rumblings about what will Europe do if the United States continues on this path of America first and disengagement. Um, do you foresee a continued movement to Europe to consolidate its own defense? And that's A. And then the huge question B, what would that look like and can they do it? I guess that's B and C.
This is really, it's really challenging. So we have to both think about what the US is going to do, what Europe will do. And, then we have to sort of compare that to some sort of
Yeah.
idealized
Right.
perspective of what the US would try to achieve
Oh
out of
yeah.
this, right?
Yeah.
And, so as I mentioned, I think the writing's been on the wall for a long time that Europe is going to have to do more for its own defense. And I think that if you have these conversations with European policymakers across the spectrum, a lot of people agree with that now. So if you think about like
Yeah.
the Green Party in Germany, they've actually become like these huge advocates for increased defense spending, which if you
Yep.
think about the Cold War legacy of where
Oh
the Green
yeah.
Party started and what
Yeah.
it is now, like you can truly understand, I think, how shocking that is, right? These are
Yeah.
folks that like demonstrated against nuclear weapons in Germany, and now they're saying, oh, the US is unreliable. We need to be able to, to have the tanks that we need to be able to defend Berlin. Um,
Yeah.
so you see some pretty big changes in realignment there. And so I think people understand that at a structural level. But
Mm.
um, what really is kind of heartbreaking for me is that I don't think that the US sort of disengaging from Europe dramatically, like suddenly, is something that is going to help Europe paradoxically develop its own defense.
Yeah.
Because I think people forget that when we look at US troops over in Europe, they're not just sitting in garrison, like camping out waiting for the Russian invasion. They're there doing security cooperation activities with European allies, which means that they're helping this group of countries that essentially are like, even the biggest of them are like US states, like,
Right.
Texas, California, all would have bigger economies than basically any European country. Um, so they're helping these militaries work with one another. They're helping them get more effective through all this training and providing this cohesive glue for sort of all the allies to plug into one another. And
Yeah.
so the US should be the one helping Europe build up its own defense, not pulling back, and letting Europe sort of pick up the pieces on its own. So I think this is a real missed opportunity, and the US should be providing, to the extent that the US is interested in this realignment between regions, even. We could even debate about whether that should be happening, but I think a lot of
Mhm.
people feel that it should be happening. To the extent the US is interested in it, the US should be helping that realignment happen instead of just leaving the Europeans to defend for themselves.
Right. And even worse, I mean, in funding for themselves, let's bring Ukraine in here because it's going
Yeah.
to come up probably multiple times. My understanding is the Ukraine war has basically tapped most of our NATO allies of all their weapons. So any excess weapons, any excess ammunition is being shipped to Ukraine. I heard something 6 months ago, something like that, that Germany would take 3 years to build up again to what the
Right.
US is providing to Ukraine, and they have to build all new plants if they, all new factories for munitions if they're going to make up for that. So that's another factor. And again, most Americans don't realize how serious the invasion of Ukraine is to European countries that are right next door. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit and what your perspective is.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Brian. I mean, you can see some countries, for example, Denmark has
Mhm.
given 100% of their artillery shells to
Right.
Ukraine.
Mhm.
Like they've just given it all away. If you think about Poland, so many fighter jets, tanks, Germany as well, who is actually the second largest provider of aid to Ukraine. People often forget, besides the US, Europe in
Right.
the whole has given more money than the US
More.
has given Ukraine in terms of both and everything except military aid. Um, so Europe is really doing a lot here. It's also balancing very different strategic priorities and trade-offs in the United States. So I think people forget that the United States, due to its position as like the world's, the holder of the world's reserve currency, has had a lot more budgetary flexibility than pretty much any country on the planet.
Oh
And
yeah.
countries like Germany, even though they're the largest, they would have to be producing all that defense. Like it's hard for them to be able to increase their budgets to those levels, and so it's been really quite challenging. And so you have not only to build up this deficit of where the countries were after providing support to Ukraine, but now having to think about what security cooperation means without having the U.S. there to sort of shepherd them through
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and just a thought that came to my head as you're saying that, we also have the US, which has 10 times the military spending of other countries and 10 times the military industrial complex. So it's not
Yeah.
even just coming up with the money. I mean, maybe they can buy it from US companies, which some people might say is one of the underlying things that's happening here. That's a possibility. But more importantly, it's just not there in Europe. There's just not enough for them to really do that kind of buildup right now.
Part of the deal after the war, as I understand it, Alex, was the U.S. shouldered a large portion of the security umbrella for our own security and for Europe's. Um, and Europe rebuilt and then spent much more on their social safety nets and things like universal health care and things like that. And we've been spending more of our budget money, federal budget money on uh, military personnel, equipment, training, and the defense of the alliance. Getting back though to could Europe arm itself? One thing that at least as far as I understand it, because of the how close the alliance has been for 75 years or whatever, we don't produce all of the weapons that we need for our military, nor do any of the states of Europe. Some things are produced, like Patriot rockets are produced in the US. Those aren't produced in Europe. And Ukraine needs them. Europe needs them because much of, like what you said, much of what was in Europe has been provided to Ukraine and that we're supposed to provide. But how willing will Europe be to provide us with the goodies that we need from them if we've sort of bailed out? There's all sorts of unpredictable friction. I can see that. I'm sort of wondering like what unintended or unexpected consequences might result along those lines that you think about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, one I hadn't considered because I guess I sort of start with the assumption that defense industrial complex will sell to whoever will buy from them. So I was less worried about that particular issue, but I could see that argument. I guess what I'm worried about are two main things. So the first is like an immediate weakness in terms of conventional deterrence in Europe. And what do I
Yeah.
mean by that? I mean that Europe doesn't have the people in uniforms and the equipment it needs to be able to
Right.
defend itself without the US sending that stuff overseas in event of a
Mhm.
contingency with Russia.
Hmm.
Now, it doesn't mean it has to be that way forever. With some period of time, Europe can and should build the stuff to actually account for, to replace that. But there was never, under any sort of circumstances, I think this discussion of what would happen if the US not only, like, the US pulled out not only that piece of like the conventional stuff, but also this other component, which is all the things that the U.S. as a very advanced military, as we mentioned, 10 times the military spending of any other country, all the stuff that it brings to the table that it provides to allies to help them
Right.
fight. So we're talking about intelligence, we're talking
Yeah.
about air power, we're talking about nuclear weapons. So that's the part that if the U.S. commitment is sort of uncertain, European states could get very nervous because they can make up for the people, they can make up for the tanks, but they can't make up for all that other stuff.
Right.
So we're looking at pretty serious issues here potentially. So that's that piece. The other thing I worry about, just from U.S. strategic priorities, is a huge issue that the U.S. has been concerned about is how Europe is going to react in as U.S. competition with China gets more serious. And what the U.S. wants is not that Europe is going to come and put troops or boats or ships to fight China, but they want an economic and political response to any
Hmm.
Chinese aggression if it happens in the future. And so to me, it just feels like sort of shooting ourselves in the foot
Yup.
if we are
Yeah.
like degrading that relationship with Europe
Well, and
because it's not just realignment; it's the relationship.
if you can clarify this one, I've heard some things, but I just don't know the answer to this. My understanding is Europe just doesn't think China's as big a deal as the US does. That they have less of a focus on Asia and China than we do. And that's one of the reasons that they're just really not contributing much in any way over there. They see Russia as much more of the issue.
In terms of security. Right.
Security
They see the
and,
economic
but also
competition as friendly competition. They
exactly
don't see the security threat from China.
right.
That's how I understand it. And is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. There's been some like great research that looked at that. There's actually pretty significant daylight between the U.S. and Europe on that. But I think what the U.S. was hoping is that it would be possible to sort of, construct some sort of coalition of the willing to diplomatically or economically respond to
Mm,
China's active aggression. And then, the Ukraine conflict was really promising because it showed that, like actually look at how, Europe can pull together to address actual threats like that. But I think what we really should be, what I'm actually kind of worried about now is we could see this going in a very different direction, which is where Europe decides to like start accommodating Russia and China in these very serious ways. And so the US is left basically without, economic or political support from its European allies and has to, face China alone.
Can I
Yeah.
follow up on that? And then because maybe one more question on Europe, and we can turn to other aspects because we have other alliances, obviously, that are important that we haven't discussed yet. But can you sort of outline for us the splits within Europe around the changes here? Because there are certainly different interests, right? The Baltic states have different interests. Um, from the Balkans, for example, and I guess since we would include NATO, you can don't we don't need EU/NATO countries, and what are the fractures there, and what might the futures be for, like, can Europe hold together even, I guess is the question.
Oh man, we could talk about this all day. Um,
You have
so
30
if you're,
Joel loves getting
yeah,
into the what ifs that take us
yeah,
down these
yeah, yeah,
horrific paths to deadly dangers.
yes.
yeah, it's like how many future book projects are people going to write about this, one question in one period?
Yes.
Right.
uh, so yeah, if you're in the eastern flank of NATO, you're laser focused on the Russian threat. If I'm Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, I'm super concerned about the Russian threat. So what these states have decided to do is really cozy up to the United States as much as possible. Uh, Trump administration folks are out there praising Poland as the model ally. This is by design. This has been a consistent issue. So some of my early research was actually on this, like how Poland's defense policy has evolved after joining NATO. And Poland is one of the countries that didn't backslide in terms of like spending money on
Right,
defense after it joined NATO. And this is
right.
because they just figure out from the beginning, like, we need to get the US is NATO. So you cozy up to the US. The US says go to Afghanistan. The US says go to Iraq. And you say, how many people do I send?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, that's not how, like the Frances and Germanys of the world have viewed this. But I think that they're starting to get a sense of the word often used, on the German side is responsibility. This is really important to Germans because they understand, with the legacy of the Second World War, there's a sense of responsibility. It's not leadership, but it's about having obligations to others. And so I think in the context of European security, it's going to be very hard for them to just, cut Ukraine loose. Um,
But Poland
so
can't be happy about our turn towards Russia here, right? Because that's Poland's main concern is Russia, is it not? So how can they cozy up to the US, and like what do they do now?
you sometimes you have to,
I think.
you have to be nice to folks that you have pretty big disagreements with. I think it's just a sense of
Mm,
like, who's writing the paychecks.
got it.
Well, I think
So
the
so
other
I
thing
think
that,
this.
and go ahead, please finish.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a lot of there's a the U.S. often thinks of management as top down, like the U.S.
Yeah.
managing the European allies. There's management upwards also
Yep.
happening.
Yeah. I think
Mhm.
the
Um,
other thing, and I'm not sure if you're implying this or not, right now it seems like the best foreign policy move by other countries is to kiss up to Trump and be, but at least in public, do the bootlicking to Trump, even if you don't mean it, make it sound like you agree with him. The Canadians managed to not do that, but many countries have been doing that, and it seems like that's a policy. I think Japan actually started it in his first administration, and countries have found that's a great way. But I could totally see Poland having two sides, the one side that says we have to totally kiss up to the US publicly, and the other side that says, how can you be cutting us off like this? How can you be harming us like this? Is
Didn't
that
work out
kind
so well for Chamberlain, did it?
of, yeah, well, Is that kind of accurate to what you see there?
I think that's absolutely accurate. And you hear all kinds of things. I love how you brought up Japan because it's a great example
Hmm.
of you know, Abe basically reaching out to Trump and getting this really close personal relationship. And I think a lot of states have sort of understood that a personal relationship is how you get things done.
Hmm.
That's been really important. It'd be interesting to see though whether some of the assumptions. I think there was like this overconfidence, and I heard it a lot of just like kind of in the Ukrainian space talking about this. There was initial like optimism after Trump got elected because the first they survived the first administration. Things were difficult, but the Biden administration wasn't exactly great for Ukraine either, in the sense that it did feel like the war was dragging on and it wasn't going anywhere, and the U.S. was not bringing it to some sort of actually sustainable endpoint. So there was this idea that we could try again and it could be better.
There's a lot of
But
foot
now
dragging
I
for
mean,
the first 2 years, right, by the
yes,
U.S. Every time,
yes,
every new weapon that they needed took us 8 months, 10 months to decide. Okay, now,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
So let me ask one more European question, Alex, before we move on. We touched on this, but I want to ask it very directly. In Trump's first term, it was pretty clear that he wanted to get rid of NATO or at least weaken it as much as
yeah.
possible. Biden comes back in, and NATO seems to be revitalized and comes together, at least to some extent, over Ukraine. And then we have a situation now where we're back to another Trump administration, and they seem more serious than ever about potentially breaking up NATO. If you had to give an Occam's razor guess, what's the most likely thing out of the million possible scenarios here?
Hmm.
What does breaking up NATO even look like? What kind of world do we live in at that point in time?
Hmm.
oh man, I'm a political scientist, so I'm simultaneously like easily entrapped by hypotheticals. Like I can't avoid them, but I
Yeah.
know I should.
See,
It's like
this
my
is
junk
why we have
food,
a
right?
podcast instead of
Yes.
an academic conference,
Yeah.
because you're not allowed to do
Right.
this stuff at academic.
Okay, so you're gonna let me just like be purely hypothetical. I'm happy to do
Exactly. I
that.
have asked you to be purely hypothetical.
Okay.
We are on record and
Yeah.
taking that into account.
um, So what's really interesting is that I think the US built a very robust series of security cooperation institutions within NATO. Because NATO is not just a treaty, it's an organization and it's a structure
Yeah.
of interaction between all these militaries that used to fight each other as recently as like 80 years ago and now
Yeah.
don't anymore because
Yeah.
they interact with one another. So I think that there are elements of that that can endure without the US. So I think what we could see is if people, kind of if you follow some of the rhetoric to its logical conclusion, the U.S. could withdraw from NATO because there's this sense that um, the stuff that's actually expensive is not the fact that the U.S. has troops that live in Europe that are like garrisoned in Europe. That stuff like you have to pay to support the troops no matter where they are in the world. The thing that's expensive is that the U.S. under the North Atlantic Treaty is committed to coming to the defense of Europe
Europe.
of the states in NATO if Russia attacks. So
Hmm.
I think that you could see some kind of wheels moving in sort of the administration where they might say like, okay, what's our way to kind of laser focus on China? Like we cut Europe loose, but that doesn't mean that the entire structure of security cooperation has to go away. So you might see this thing that I think there's going to be that if that does happen, that would be really negative for the United States on multiple dimensions that we could get into in terms of credibility, in terms of cutting loose this institution that the U.S. has created, in terms of the fact that the U.S. might end up fighting in a war in Europe anyway.
Right.
And that's definitely not an efficient way to do it. We
Yeah.
It's
tried
going to
the
be
No.
a
Ostrow
much
thing.
worse war in
Yeah.
Europe if we gave up and then had to go
Yes,
back.
But yeah.
exactly. So that would be the
Yeah.
worst.
I mean, Brian and I both kind of alluded to this, but in terms of NATO or the EU, I mean, do you see change happening in sort of the pro Europe direction as a response from places like Hungary or Slovakia or Turkey and NATO, the states that had started to drift towards the right, even Romania a little bit. Like, do you see them saying, okay, we're going to go with the US and we're all going with Russia now? Or will they say, wait a minute, no, we don't like Russia, we're going to re solidify the union?
I think if we look at sort of so the Europeans had that emergency meeting. It's like when you have like a big group chat going and somebody's just being really annoying, you start a separate group chat so you can complain about that person. That's
All right, I
literally
think
what they
you
did.
you just had the analogy of the month. Thank you
That's
very
the
much.
best. So they just kicked the U.S. out of the group chat. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Or they were like, we're going to listen to them rant there. And they're like, oh my God, look at what they're
Yeah,
writing.
yeah.
So they did that, and they didn't include everybody. I think Hungary was like notably absent from that,
Yeah.
if I recall. So it was basically like the inner circle sort of meeting, and I think that kind of points into some clues in terms of how they're already thinking of cooperation
Sure.
circles developing.
That makes sense. Joel, where do you want to go next?
What do we call NAFTA now? Whatever the hell they renamed it. What about the North American Alliance? U.S., Canada, Mexico. You're in a
Oh
border
boy.
state. um,
Yes.
what do you see? What's underneath this? What's really likely to happen?
To be totally honest, I'm deeply confused about what exactly is going on here in terms of policy objectives.
So you're with the rest of us. Good.
Yes.
Yes.
But you have to answer the question.
Europe.
We get to ask it.
All right. I see what you did there. Okay, let's go north with Canada. I don't understand what this is about. I really don't.
Right.
It's a problem, but it's a solution without a problem.
It's not fentanyl coming from there. It's the shrooms. Right?
Yeah, it's more,
It's fentanyl going the other way.
Yeah.
And if they can beat us in hockey, they're obviously going to beat us at an insurgency if we invade. So,
They have trained fighters over there. It's not just the Mounties. There's a lot of other people. So I'm
But
going
it
to
is
put
the
out
most
something. I'm going
important
to put out
alliance.
something here and let you respond to this as a slightly different question. I think it's chaos making. So to me, the reason behind it is not a strategic reason. It is a intent to create chaos. I say this with all absolute respect to Donald Trump because it's his words, and he said them in his autobiography. This is his management style. He creates chaos and sees what happens.
And Musk too.
Yeah, and he said that many times since. The question here, though, is let's assume for the moment it is chaos. Let's assume there's no good reason for it. What does that do to the alliance? What does that do from the perspectives of Canada and Mexico?
Right.
If they're looking at this and they're thinking the same way we are, how does that affect them? And what's the likely blowback going to be to the U.S.? Can you even answer that? Do we even have enough data to make a guess at that one?
I just want to say, because we started this conversation talking about like the social and the personal relationships and how they matter. And I just want to talk about, so as part of the research that I've done, I spent a lot of time, in doing lots of interviews with people from across the NATO allies and, went to Ukraine a couple times, talked to them as well. And a huge part of like security cooperation efforts before 2022 were actually involving the Canadians. And one thing that stood out to me was just how patient they were about all of this. Like they didn't claim credit. They, were willing to play second fiddle to the British who were actually trying to oversee, their effort, their training effort. And they're still like, even though, it was Canadian flagged, it was like under, close cooperation with the British. So they were willing to do all of this. But underneath that patience, there's like this subtle resentment that like, they keep claiming all the credit. They keep doing all of this. And so this is sort of my fear about all of this is like, you think you can just, push the Canadians, you can berate, but like this stuff comes back on you eventually. Like, even if this coercive tools end up getting the U.S. some sort of better economic deal, which we could debate whether that's even the case. Like, I think there are actual repercussions to damaging diplomatic relationships, especially one as deep-seated as like the U.S.-Canadian relationship, where there's a lot of things that Canada has been willing to sort of, kind of be patient about. And, it's just going to bring all of that to the forefront.
Yeah, and
trust really matters, right? When I teach international relations, I teach it really weirdly. I really focus on the relations, and every opportunity I can, I sort of discuss healthy personal relationships and unhealthy ones. Why do divorces happen and things like that, right? Throughout the whole semester, I go through that, and even like discussing, the decision-making models or perception and misperception stuff. We're getting into the jargony stuff, but it's like, you know, think about what happens to your brain when you have an argument with a loved one, like a serious argument, right? It's always their fault. It's never our fault, right? The relationships matter, and they're built on trust is a big part of it. We've eroded part of that trust, I think, is what you're implying. And we don't know what the long-term impact of that will be, but it puts distance in what was really one of the closest um, relationships between two states on the globe, right? Like a long
Yeah.
and peaceful border, friendly. It's who knows what it means. Would you say that is the situation relating to Mexico different from that you see with Canada, or is it kind of the same dynamic?
So it's almost like, if you already are used to having, to use some of your metaphors, conflictual relationships with someone, you're almost like each individual argument may mean less because it's
Mhm.
within this pattern with lower trust, right?
Right.
So that's why I'm so concerned about Canada, because it feels like
Yeah.
you go from this high trust relationship to one
Yeah.
now of extreme, of, some really insulting things being said. So
Hmm.
insult, I think, is, important here as a word. For
Yeah.
Mexico, it's not that there's no hiccups in what's going on here, but I can't really say. I mean, I'm interested in your take on this, and I'm no expert on the U.S. Mexico relationship, but I don't think the trust was extremely high to begin with because it's already been a more conflictual relationship.
With
I,
Mexico.
And
I Yeah, I
yes,
would
Yeah.
think your analogy is good because we've been fighting over immigration back and forth for a long,
exactly.
long time. And that you're absolutely right in saying conflictual relationship. I think that makes a ton of sense. And you get used to it, especially if you're the smaller partner. I would think you have to have your techniques to get through that conflictual relationship. That makes a lot of sense. Um,
Right, and you're already used to thinking about it like there are techniques you can use to manage this. If you look at U.S. relationships with partners, for example, in the counterinsurgency wars, these were long, enduring relationships that often had a lot of conflict in it, but both sides were kind of able to play and try to get what they want. Like if you think about the U.S. and Afghanistan, they're sort of starting from this baseline, like this doesn't really work. Let's see what's in it for me.
yeah. Why don't we go to Asia since we don't have forever today? But uh, let's look at it from a couple perspectives. So I think that the three things that minimum we need to talk about, and please add more in that are important that we're missing here: relationship with China and where we go with China, which was a constant fixation of President Trump in his first term, and then relationship with Japan, our most important ally there, both defense relationship and trade relationship too, and then just ASEAN and the regional side of things, if there are any others that are particularly important, Philippines on ocean
Mm.
space, oil fields, or things like that. Where do you see these things going? What should we be looking for on these things?
Yeah. So China, I think you're absolutely right to underscore. You described it as a fixation in the first term, and what's really interesting is the Trump administration essentially turned around the Washington consensus around how to view China. I think, and if
Yeah.
you look at what the Biden administration did, I think that there was this recognition of a lot of the same themes that the first Trump administration had highlighted.
Mhm.
So, I think that the Trump administration is highlighting things like investing in AI or technological overmatch or competition with China. And, maybe the way they talk about it is different. But a lot of the themes, direct carryover from themes that the Biden administration was talking about. So we might actually see like less daylight on these issues
Okay.
than you might expect, I think.
Also, let me just interject for a second here before moving on to other things. I like the fact, and I'm interested in the fact that you focus on the AI and the high tech side, because honestly, I have done some looking into Chinese military, and the military is just not that much of a threat to us, except for the fact that it's huge. But the technical side, the potential for AI, the
Yes.
potential for disruptions if they get into the internet, that's absolutely enormous. So that would seem like the bigger threat area there.
I agree. I think there's this sense that if this is going to become like this is becoming like the nuclear arms race, that if the U.S. doesn't
Mhm.
invest in this, like China will find some better, uh, you know, checkmate technology that will
Yeah.
really disrupt how we think about military force.
Yep. Good. So I'm sorry, you were going to go to think a different
Yeah.
place in Asia, Japan or something else, or if you had more on China.
Oh, yeah. So I was going to say that I think, since we might expect there to be actually a fair amount of continuity in terms of how the Trump administration is thinking about China, it's unclear to me yet what, the administration's approach towards managing, allies and partners is going to be like in this region. So maybe another way of putting this is how much of the chaos that we're seeing in Europe is because the Trump administration has decided that Europe is just not strategically important. And then therefore, when it comes to relationships that the Trump administration does care about, that it will be much more careful with managing that, or at least that it will stay within a narrower range. Because it's not like the first administration was without its hiccups, but like I don't think we've seen quite, it feels like a lot was compressed into the past week with Europe on a scale that,
Right.
maybe
Yeah.
took place over months
Yeah.
with the first administration. So maybe Asia, and, Trump 2.0 will actually look a lot more like the first administration. That's my, if I had to if I had to stake out a position, that's my guess. I think it's a little early given the focus on
Yeah.
Ukraine to really
Yeah.
know much yet.
Yeah, and
Can I
I
put
kind
this in
of
a
wanted to
blow?
I kind of wanted to leave that open to you because I have no
Yeah.
idea. We have enough data to tell, so that's a good answer.
Yeah. But I'm going to put it in a blender now. So to the extent that U.S. foreign policy is drifting more towards Russia, which seems to be evident, right? Like warming up and trying to, how did they put it, forge a positive collaborative path forward, something like that. Russia has been pretty closely aligned over the last 2.5, 3 years with China and North Korea, supporting its effort to avoid sanctions and to supply Ukraine and Iran. And yet, the U.S., the Trump administration is clearly hostile to China and certainly towards Iran. But Russia's friendly with those two quite a bit, with Iran and North Korea. Can you unscramble this, or is it just stay scrambled? Like, what are the
Yeah.
implications
So
of us gravitating towards Russia? Will we suddenly be allied with North Korea, China, and Iran?
So the first thing is like it's actually hard to tell. I mean, so the optimist in me wants to say, okay, we're not actually aligning with Russia. What's really happening is that Trump is trying to find some way of sort of, acceding to enough Russian demands because Russia fought this war not just over the material stuff, but about the status and about the narrative.
Yeah.
So to some extent, coming in and saying, Russia, you don't take all the blame, we can actually get like that's already making a major concession, but sometimes unilateral concessions, there's research on this, can be useful in bargaining. So the optimist of me wants to say that's happening. And the realist in me is saying that probably it's not, because I just don't think that most governments are that strategic all the time.
Yeah.
And also it's too early to tell. And, if Eastern Europe tells us anything, it's always going to be bad, and it could still, don't worry, it could still be worse.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we don't know yet about Russia, but that's that. In terms of Russia and China, like there's debate about this, but I see it as more of a marriage of convenience. Both states are very practically minded, and they're in it because it works for them. So if the U.S. cozies up to Russia, what that would do in terms of Russia's alignment with China, unclear. I don't think we can just take their relationship as a given, which is actually ultimately good for the U.S. because I think having Russia and China in lockstep is not a strategic outcome the U.S. should prefer.
Yeah, and actually, my understanding was Russia turned more to North Korea because China wasn't willing to give it all that Russia wanted. Putin wasn't
That's
getting
correct.
everything he wanted out of Russia, so he had to go to North Korea and even Iran for drones and artillery and things like that.
Got it cheaper from North Korea. I think China would have provided it, but China wanted more. It was a business decision. Yeah.
Business transaction.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, maybe our last place, but I'm not sure. Let's go to the Middle East and talk about the blender there. Let me set the
Nothing
tone a
happening
little.
there.
Let me set the tone a
Have
little.
you put your down payment on the condo in Gaza yet?
Yeah, exactly. Golf course membership. So this is one of the big places that the administration has thrown into a little bit more chaos. We all know about Trump wanting Gaza without even having to buy it and make it the newest Riviera of the Middle East. But I'd say the bigger things are, what is the relationship with Israel going to do? They had a very Trump and Netanyahu had a very close relationship to the point of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And then also, the U.S. has already put Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, three of our closest allies, in a bad spot by
Mhm.
making their statements about both Gaza and about shipping all the Palestinians out of
Mhm.
Gaza. So, what are those relationships looking like as far as we can tell right now? And do you have any feel for what we might be seeing there?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And the U.S.-Israel relationship, just from my scholarly nerd out thing for just a brief second, is amazing because it doesn't have a formal alliance, but yet
Right,
it's one of the tightest
right.
partnerships that you could see. So at a time when we're literally like reevaluating every alliance and partnership, being like, is it strategically useful? It's kind of interesting, what we choose to reevaluate or don't reevaluate. So just kind of highlight that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that there's a complicated set of reasons. I think why, especially given kind of Republican domestic politics, sort of where Israel fits into that narrative for the United States. But it definitely does complicate working relationships with other states. So that might be a place where I'd be like, okay, maybe we should apply a little bit more of a strategic perspective, and that we can kind of thread that needle that other administrations have done before, which is like, how can you work with this very complicated set of states that don't all work together? So it's very different than like in Europe, where the US created a security community of states that do work very closely with one another, to Asia, where the US is sort of trying to forge those ties with less success, but still a lot of progress, like the Republic of Korea, Japan, US trilateral um, consultation pact that was signed recently. So you have that, and then in the Middle East, of course, it's like those ties just don't really gel together. So there's some
Yeah.
strategic trade offs, which I guess is a non-answer, but there you go.
No, that makes sense. Although, actually, I mean, I give the Trump administration credit. Through the first administration, they didn't do it necessarily, but they set up the groundwork for Saudi Arabia and Israel to get closer together. And then the
That's a good
invasion
point.
of, the fight in Gaza, October 7th, followed by the Israeli invasion, pushed back on that. And from what we know from Hamas, that was purposeful. It was trying to break them
Mhm.
up. But one of
Mhm.
the, questions I have, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, is does the U.S. have a role to play in bringing those countries together again? And I think most people in the region look at it as the anti-Iran alliance in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. So I don't know if you have any extra thoughts there on how that might go. How long would it take the Saudis, as an example, or to come back to the table, given what's happened between Israel and Gaza?
That's a great point. I mean, I'll be honest, like the Middle East is very much out of my area. I spent a lot
Yeah,
of, so now I'm
okay,
getting these flashbacks thinking
no
about the
problem.
first Trump administration, remembering the fact that, we almost went to war with Iran once, but,
Yeah,
you
Yep.
know, so if we've learned anything from the first time around, it's that I feel like the Middle East will always find, as much as presidents, since the W administration have basically tried to be like, let's focus, which people forget, like the original pivot before the pivot person was like W. Bush was like,
oh
we're going
yeah,
to focus on China. And the Middle East is always like, no, you're going to focus
Mhm.
on me.
yeah.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of room there for, that to potentially be an area where the Trump administration has to get a lot more involved than it would like to be.
Yeah. Joel, you want to take us anyplace else, or you want to get a wrap up question?
I, I've been thinking about we have a traditional stupid question, which is wave your magic wand. How do you fix it? But I think that answer, at least in terms of how our conversation's gone, is too straightforward. So I'm going to ask you to wave your magic wand and make it be 2027, let's say. Uh, what does it look like?
Oh
We
gosh.
like to end with really
It's
stupid questions because that's all we usually can come up with.
Now,
stupid question.
Alex, we're not just asking you to be hypothetical. We're asking you to be a hypothetical futurist. So
Yeah.
You know,
that's putting you on the
it's like
spot at
all the
all.
warning bells as political scientists are going off. Like, don't make me do this.
Oh yeah. Don't be a political scientist now.
The stupid questions are always the best, though, which is I tell my students, because usually what they're uncovering is something really foundational, and that's where do we want to see the world going.
Yeah.
And I'm a little, I'm not sure that we have a clear articulation of that yet from anyone on the US side. This isn't just a Trump issue. This is a broader issue. So even if you listen to, the Biden administration's policies on this, a lot of it sounded like let's do more of the same. So they sounded like almost deeply conservative, like small c, like as in
Right.
like we don't want things to change very much.
I
And the
think it's
reality is that the US is not the only factor getting to decide if like international order changes or if the balance of power changes. And the US has only so many levers it can actually pull on this. And so, even with competition of China, we're sort of putting that in. What does that mean? What are we competing over?
Right.
Is this going to just be a Cold War 2.0? I sincerely hope not, because there were a lot of very negative aspects of the first Cold War, and we're lucky it ended the way it did. Like, this is a huge issue.
right.
Like it isn't the case that we just won the Cold War and defeated the USSR. It kind of defeated itself. So I think that that broader sense of where do we want the world to be in 2 years and 5 years, I would like to say at the very least, no great power war. That's what I would like to see.
That'd be nice.
That's
We
that's
hope
the
Low
thing
bar
would-
there, Alex.
Good
Low
one.
bar.
Yes.
That's a good one.
It's a good
I
bar, but it's a low one. Yeah,
I'm just thinking as you're
we can all
talking on the
agree.
China side, the difference between the Cold War and now is Russia
Yeah.
wasn't a major international economic power. They had a
Right.
block, but they didn't have their hands in everything economically, and that makes it even more complicated.
And China as well, both of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, exactly. All
Yeah.
right. Well, Alex Chinchilla, thank you very much for joining us.
you
We
so much.
really appreciate your perspective. Sorry if we put you on the spot a little bit. We should have mentioned a water cooler chat kind of situation.
Yeah.
Oh no, all good. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the conversation.
And
Excellent.
as things pan out, I loved your answer, because how can you predict the future? Because it's not even clear that those in power in Washington have an idea of what they're aiming for. Like in
We
your
don't know
discussion
what
about
we
Canada,
want.
it's just confusing.
We don't know what we
Yeah.
want. Yeah.
But this has been great, and maybe as whether future discussion focused on Europe or focused on Canada or focused on Mexico, focused on the things are going to keep changing. It's been a great conversation. Would hope to have you back again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please like and share and follow our podcast. Thanks, David, for producing. Brian, who am I forgetting to thank?
I think that's it.
Cool. See y'all next time.
Thanks.